Hi, everybody. Welcome back to PCS 101, and this is for our class for Friday, the 2nd of January. So I hope you all had a good new year, and we continue forward with talking about some of the elements of public speaking. And today I wanted to talk about two chapters, understanding audience and audience analysis. So, in the new edition of the textbook, if you're using that edition, that would be chapter 4 and chapter 5. And if you're using one of the previous editions, you might have to search around for some of this information. But I'm covering the major points. And as you know, we are preparing for our first speech next week, our autobiographical speech, which is a 5-minute speech in which you can tell your audience, your classmates, a little bit about yourself. Some of you, I suspect, will want to do a life overview. And obviously, the major challenge with that is trying to determine which pieces of your life that you want to discuss. And you've got only 5 minutes, so obviously you're going to have to condense. You may want to focus on a particular time period. And again, you would need to think about what about that time period is most important for you to share with your audience. Perhaps you want to talk about a particular topic, let's say something like an element that is important to you, a hobby or an interest. There are lots of different ways that you could go about this particular speech. And if you aren't necessarily sure how to proceed, or you're not very sure about how much you want to self-disclose, I usually recommend that you talk about education, because it is the one commonality we all share, whether you want to talk about your educational history or you want to talk about your educational present, because not everyone decides to take a class during the intersession. Or perhaps you want to talk about your future goals for education. And regardless of what it is that you are discussing, you do need to think about your audience. And that's what chapter 4 is about, understanding your audience. And also understanding that there's a difference between hearing, which is passive, just processing sound, and listening, which is paying attention and understanding and being active. And as you know, I'm going to ask you to upload your speeches onto Moodle so that your classmates can view your speech in addition to myself. And when you are watching those speeches, you want to do more than just hear those speeches. You want to actually listen to them. I'm going to ask you to send me a strength and weakness of each of the speeches that you view, but also, I want you to think about those speeches in the context of your own speech. And hopefully, by watching all of those speeches, in addition to delivering your own speech, you will get lots of techniques and ideas for how to go about delivering a speech. And I had indicated that very soon I'm going to show you some sample student autobiographical speeches, students who are not in any way connected with GCC, so you don't have to worry that one day you might be a case study in one of my classes, so that you can get a sense of some modeling of how you could go about your autobiographical speech. One of the things that oftentimes is very useful when you are listening is note taking. And it's one of the reasons why we encourage note taking in a class, because ultimately people's minds tend to drift. So, thinking about techniques for note taking, one of the most common is that you are reviewing the material, because it's more than just writing down what's happening, and then you're relating that material to information you already know, and you are anticipating how you can apply that information in the future. That's known as RRA: review, relate, anticipate. There are lots of barriers to paying attention, and one of the things in a 101 class such as this one is that you are introduced to language, and what you may know informally as daydreaming has actually a term associated with it that is known as the internal perceptual field. That basically we think more quickly than someone can speak. which means that our minds tend to drift. And as we all know, one idea leads to the other, that leads to another. So you can lose major elements that are being discussed. Or the external perceptual field. Internal is inside, hence the mind. External would be the environment. So anything in your environment that could interfere with listening or paying attention. And that could be temperature, that could be noise, that could be lighting. Sometimes you have the ability to manipulate those things, sometimes you don't. Another thing that can interfere with an audience paying attention are trigger words. These are words that tend to evoke strong emotional responses from an audience member. And of course, you can't anticipate what everyone's trigger word is, but you can certainly assume that most people share trigger words that are associated with, let's say, trauma, or that are in one way or another associated with negatives associated with society. So just be cautious when you're using trigger words or what you think might be a trigger word. Again, you can't anticipate what will be a trigger word for everyone. And thinking about the different kinds of listening that we engage in on a daily basis. There's appreciative listening, which is listening for entertainment, but you're probably not paying a whole lot of attention. It would be nice if we could listen this way with our peer speeches. I find them to be quite entertaining. I think it's quite interesting to hear about students in a class. And discriminative listening is when you're looking for the presentation. We will be talking about presentation skills over the next couple of classes. Things like eye contact and body language, for instance. Empathic listening is emotionally supportive listening. And I would suggest that we could also engage in this kind of listening when we're listening to the speeches of others. We may not necessarily agree with what someone is discussing, but we can certainly be supportive of the fact that we are all on the same journey of trying to improve our public speaking skills. Listening for comprehension, which is probably what you're doing right now. That's the most common kind of listening that you would do in an academic context. And critical listening, I believe I talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the semester when I was reviewing the syllabus. Questioning and analyzing and interpreting. And I would argue that you will utilize all of those listening techniques when you are watching the speeches of others. And in fact, you're even given questions when listening to speeches. And as you might remember in the syllabus and course outline, there was a speech rating handout that talked a little bit about the elements that I'm going to be reviewing when I'm evaluating your speeches. So this might be of use to you when you are listening to peer speeches or even constructing your own speech. Now, I'm going to review this handout in a little bit more depth after the next few chapters, just so that we've got most of the elements that are going to be on that handout discussed in class. But certainly, you can take a quick peek now and see that things are divided into content and delivery, which is basically the way that we think about speeches, is that yes, it's what you're saying, but it's also how you're saying it. Now, in terms of audience analysis, this gets to the idea of culture, which I had talked a little bit about, I believe, last class as well. In the broadest definition of the term, culture is any group membership. So if you've got 3 or more individuals who are part of a group, then basically they could be viewed as a culture. Usually we think of cultures as being very large groups based on demographics. These are observable characteristics such as age or gender or ethnicity. But culture can be very specialized. So any kind of group membership, it can be based on a location. So the culture, let's say, of Western Massachusetts or of Greenfield, Massachusetts, or of Greenfield Community College. And For better or for worse, our class is indeed a culture that we are a group that will have a certain element of predictability based on behaviors, attitudes, values, and beliefs. And that's not to say that everybody is going to be following all of those elements, but that you can get a certain sense. And if you've ever been in a class before, you know that classes develop personalities that are similar to individual personalities. Some classes are more quiet, some classes are more vocal. So the idea of behaviors, actions, these are observable traits, and this includes conversational styles. So the way that people present themselves orally, some people are more wordy and long-winded, and some people are more concise. In the West, which is the United States, for instance, it's oftentimes been said that the conversational style that is usually preferred is to be direct. There are other cultures, think about Asian cultures, for instance, where the conversational style is the exact opposite. It's not to be direct because you want to try to save face. One isn't necessarily better than another, it's just different. But obviously, you could see how there can be conflict or at least misunderstanding if you've got two groups with different conversational styles who don't understand the other group's style. Attitudes or feelings, and that can change over time, but sometimes they can be very firmly embedded. Beliefs, what you think is true and false. All of this will be particularly important when we talk about the persuasive speech, because ultimately you will be asking individuals to perhaps change their behaviors or their attitudes or their beliefs. Values are firmly embedded, and I suggest that they are highly resistant to change and include things like behaviors, attitudes, and um, and beliefs. Um, and that said, you're not necessarily evaluated as to whether or not everybody is going to agree with your particular perspective. What you want to do is to earn everybody's respect, even though they don't necessarily agree with your perspective. Now, there isn't much probably that will be controversial in the autobiographical speech. That's done deliberately because basically you're talking about your own life experience. Now, that said, you might decide to talk about sensitive topics about your life, and that's perfectly fine as long as you're doing it in an appropriate way for your audience, which is a college level audience, which means that you've got more latitude than if you were speaking to, let's say, a general audience where you might have a mixture of a lot of different age groups and a lot of different educational levels. But you get to decide with your autobiographical speech how much or how little you want to self disclose about yourself. And when we get to the persuasive speech, ultimately you'll get to decide how controversial of a topic you want to tackle. And I would argue that if we can't talk about controversial topics in this situation, in an academic situation, then we probably can't talk about them as a society either. So I encourage you, not to necessarily be dissuaded by talking about a controversial topic. The key is how to do it so that you can earn your audience's respect. And I think that's something that our politicians in particular could use some time evaluating and practicing. But more on that later, because we're talking about audience right now, not necessarily speakers. And demographics, as I had indicated earlier, are the observable characteristics of individuals. Things like age and gender and ethnic background, education, political affiliation, religion, whatever the case may be. But again, it can be very specialized. So, for instance, pug lovers, and I can tell you I do belong to that demographic. I have a pug and I love my pug. And we have very predictable beliefs and values and attitudes about pugs more often than not. And that oftentimes results in particular behaviors as well. So, audience segmentation, and this is a discipline in and of itself, particularly in the older days of advertising when we didn't necessarily have targeted ads through social media and the internet. Ads were basically telecast on TV or on the radio, or perhaps put in magazines that more often than not were geared to very wide general audiences. And the hope was that based on the audience that would be likely to be watching or listening or reading during that particular time, that you could target the message to them. Of course, we've gotten to the point now where messages can be targeted literally to individuals, which is both positive and negative. But audience segmentation is dividing your audience into demographic groups. Who are the groups? And you will probably have multiple groups that are in your audience, and how do you appeal to those groups? Psychological profiling, and this is also a a discipline in and of itself. Um, when you're trying to determine what these demographic groups might believe, what their attitudes might be, what their values might be, and again, you want to try to avoid stereotypes, these overgeneralizations, because not everybody in a group is the same. So, hostile audiences, and I don't think you're probably going to ever be in this position. Usually, somebody knows when they're going to be addressing a hostile audience. In politics, for instance, this might happen when you're talking to a group of individuals from a different political persuasion. But you might be dealing with a skeptical audience. Many of the techniques are the same. I don't have necessarily a magic bullet for you. So I can't say that if you were to do X, Y, and Z, then ultimately you would have a successful experience with a hostile or a skeptical audience. But some techniques that can be useful: establishing goodwill, that there isn't any negative animus, that, let's say, from the audience or the speaker, that we're all trying our very best to establish areas of agreement. So while we oftentimes focus on areas of disagreement, focusing on areas that we agree upon, establishing credibility. So this is part of earning the audience's respect. Sometimes you've already got embedded credibility in your speech. For instance, your autobiographical speech, you have credibility because it's your life. Now, that said, the informative speech, you might need to establish that you have some credibility for the topic that you're talking about, whether you've done research on it or you have some prior knowledge about it and how and why that came about. Using credible outside sources, and that's becoming increasingly difficult because, as we know, anybody can post anything on the internet. But now that we've got artificial intelligence that isn't as reliable as many people think it is, the tendency for it to hallucinate or just to create fictional information has led to even more pressure for individuals to fact check the information that they're getting. But using outside sources can be very helpful in terms of establishing credibility and helping to persuade an audience, or at the very least, helping a skeptical or even hostile audience admit that you do know your information and that you were professional and well prepared, even though they may not necessarily agree with you. Humor can be a great leveler, but that said, humor is oftentimes culturally based. What is humorous to one group of individuals may not necessarily be humorous to another group of individuals. So again, you've got to think about the time and the place and what's appropriate. Trying to be multi-sided, or what I call addressing the elephant in the room, that some individuals try so hard with establishing what in effect is, their position, that they act as if no other positions exist. And obviously that's not true. Sometimes people just want to be acknowledged that they have a position that has some value to it, or at least that has some other individuals interested in it, and to establish principles of judgment, so that if there are a certain level of ground rules of how we're going to evaluate things, then hopefully individuals will establish those ground rules. But again, I don't have necessarily a magic bullet for you. But at this point, you should be thinking about speech number 1, and hopefully thinking about speech number 2, the informative speech, 10-minute speech, where you will be using one one or more audio or visuals, which we will discuss. And speech number 3, the 15-minute persuasive speech, where you will be using a minimum of 3 outside sources. And of course, we'll talk more about that as the semester progresses. This is not to preclude you from using an audio visual in your first speech or using outside resources in your first speech, but I did want you to concentrate on speech delivery in your first speech. So what we're going to do next class is talk about things like generating ideas, because we're at the point now where you are trying to make decisions about what it is you're going to be talking about for your first speech. Writing outlines, because outlines will be very useful for you, as well as how do you organize your information, because the more organized your information is, the easier it is for your audience to understand, the easier it is for you to remember to deliver it. And also, remember, you don't want to memorize your speech. You, as the Toastmasters video talked about, you want an outline that has just keywords and phrases to remind you of the major points that you're going to be discussing. And also, we will talk about introductions and conclusions, and also the discussion section or the body of speech. But the introduction, the conclusion is particularly important because people tend to remember what they hear first and what they hear last, which we will talk about a little bit next class. So, thinking about our attendance question in light of our upcoming speech, your attendance question is about speech number 1. What do you think will be your biggest challenge in delivering speech number 1, and why? What do you think will be your biggest challenge in delivering speech number 1, and why? And you aren't required to respond to your peers, though you're certainly encouraged to, the way you would in a face-to-face class. But what you are required to do is to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. So now I'm going to start responding to your responses to the discussion forum. I wanted to wait a little bit as people were adding and dropping classes and so forth, this being such a highly condensed semester. So the challenge question about speech number 1 would be due Sunday, which is January 4th. And if you need additional time, please let me know. But of course, as we move into next week, we will be moving a little bit faster as we get ready for our first speech. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.